Thank you so much for having me speak at the conference today. I'm quite excited to engage in this topic on technology, science and technology governance. Some of my remarks today are going to be more along the lines of boundaries and boundary setting and understanding the nuances of definitions, as well as understanding some of the practical difficulties around the notion of governance. So we often consider governance to be a solution to many problems around science and technology development, from the Asilomar principles to on recombinant DNA, to thinking around autonomous weapon systems, to any sort of disarmament conversation, as well as even from genetically modified foods. We really do have a wide variety of instances and cases where governance was undertaken in one form or another. However, I would say that, it would be wonderful if we could have a very clear law, a policy, or a norm, or some sort of coercive mechanism that could govern the designers, developers, companies, governments, or even just individual tinkerers in their garages or their labs to ensure that responsible research and innovation takes place. But that in some instances is a bit of a hopeful wish. Governance governance is an umbrella term that encompasses many different types of regulation, of potentially coercive regulation, or of even self-censorship. And so really understanding the myriad forms of governance also is difficult, because what we're talking about is science and technology, which in and of itself is such a broad term to encompass so many different kinds of technologies, so many different types of scientific endeavor, and to try, I think, to think about science and technology governance is so big, is too broad, and draws the boundaries in such a way that any sort of practical guidance would almost be useless. So broad brush approaches to science and technology governance really end up falling into two different camps. One camp is the kind of, it's so big, it's so broad, it's so diverse, we cannot possibly govern it. And so in that instance, it's just the Wild West. We should let everything go. The best ideas will percolate up to the top, and there will be some sort of clash of ideas and norms, and the best or the right will win out. We also that is a false narrative, as we know. But the other side of that coin is the other type of reaction, which is we must ban all of these different types of technologies or scientific endeavors because they are too risky. They can escalate into too many adverse reactions or disastrous consequences for humanity writ large, or for a specific subset of a population, for the environment. And so because there is this sort of false dichotomy between everything is permitted and everything is impermissible and therefore banned, through some sort of legal mechanism which is yet to be determined, that seems to me to be drawing the boundaries and putting the guideposts too far apart. And it also tends to push us in one direction or another that is not entirely helpful, because scientific endeavors can go in, again, a wide variety of directions, and how those scientific endeavors and technological developments evolve are also not unitary, right? It's not one person or one organization that's doing this. In fact, it is more of a patchwork quilt of lots of different entities, individuals, organizations, funding mechanisms, and in some instances, international partnerships. And so we need to be much more nuanced in our thinking about how to govern technology. So I think that to be more nuanced in our thinking and to be, a little bit more gracious to our scientific counterparts and our technology developers, we have to think about all of the different kind of layers of analysis or levels of analysis in political science, as we call them. And there's multiples of these, right? There are the obvious ones in the room. There's the technology developers, there's the companies, the industries writ large. There's even sectors, right? There's even states and state governments. And then there's multinational coalitions, and there's non-governmental organizations, and there's professional societies. Like, all of these entities are in some ways a level of analysis with which we can look to try to understand who's doing what and how we can best shape and incentivize the right behavior. And I would actually suggest that instead of talking about governance, what we're really talking about is incentives. So one of the incentives that is incredibly strong and is also incredibly difficult to study and change is culture. Scientific cultures vary across disciplines. Up until recently, you know, the computer science discipline really didn't have a culture, so to speak. No one thought that they had any sort of moral responsibilities or legal responsibilities in their development, and now we see that changing. The medical field has long had lots of these moral guideposts and obligations, whereas in the legal fields as well. But some of these other newer disciplines do not. That said, the culture of even an individual, not just an individual discipline, but even an individual lab can vary quite greatly. And so this kind of push to understanding the cultural variations and where the incentives are within the lab, within the discipline, within the university, within the company is really, really increasingly important if you want to enculturate responsible research and innovation. So that's one side of the culture argument, is that scientific culture and what good looks like. You know, risky behaviors may be rewarded in some instances and not in others. We see this, in fact, with a lot of the outcries around genomic engineering and things like this coming out of China. But the other thing, too, is that scientific cultures are one part, but this is kind of a Russian doll effect, right? They're nested. And so there's other cultural elements that are going to affect attitudes towards innovation, who's included, who's excluded, and who the proper authorities are. And that question of authority is actually increasingly important because the cultural aspects around authority also tend to bleed into questions around regime type and whether or not a state's, the characterization of a state's regime matters or influences how technology is developed. And so one can be an authority, that is someone who may be a subject matter expert, who is widely respected in their field, but someone can be in authority as well. And this is more about role responsibilities and the types of powers and rights that that role has. And those are two interesting ways to dissect this as well, is because if science and technology development is beholden to a particular type of role or an authority, that can very much color the ways in which technology is developed as well as how it's deployed. And so the governance in that aspect takes on a completely different meaning, because if those in authority are demanding certain types of technological developments, there seems to be something slightly off here about what we talk about when the assumption about technology governance. If the authorities are telling you to do unethical things, where does the governance really lie? So as I said before, I think the regime type argument is also very, very crucial when we're talking about meaningful governance. And coming out of political science, we can think about a wide variety of different kinds of regimes. The three classic characterizations, right, are democracies, authoritarian governments, and I would then say totalitarian governments. And the major difference that I think will push back against governance is the difference between not just democratic regimes and authoritarian regimes, but really the presence of totalitarian or hybrid totalitarian regimes. And a totalitarian regime really is, its main purpose is to break down the division between public and private, to erase the capability for freedom of thought, to erase the capabilities for freedom of speech. Thought and speech, at least in John Stuart Mill's work, right, are very clearly linked. And so when you break down the division between the public and the private sphere, and you no longer have that freedom of thought and freedom of speech, you start to see where technology can very much be designed to maintain that status quo. We can think of this in China currently with the Uyghur population, the internment camps, the reprogramming and propaganda, or even very highly surveillance states, right? And the use of particular technologies to continually monitor, surveil, and manipulate a population. And in one instance, actually in Professor Reese's book, where he talks about in chapter 5 around transparency and perhaps an end to privacy as a cure for this, that surveillance in some sense might be a cure to ensuring proper governance, seems to me to flirt with a cure that is worse than the illness. And so I would be very, very careful around that, because it starts to creep into these kind of discussions around the use by particular regime types of technologies for very malicious purposes. So, and when I say meaningful governance here, right, if you take, if you take the Chinese case, for instance, you know, the regime itself, it's a law and order regime on paper, but for instance, the judiciary is very tightly bound to the party, the Chinese Communist Party, and so there isn't really a division between, you know, the governing body of the party and the judicial branch. Not to mention all of the use of things like internment camps and othering and attempts at reprogramming and propaganda. And so I think there is something quite unique when it comes to the flavors of totalitarian regimes and how that can very much influence the trajectory of scientific and technological development. And if we're looking to the state or we're looking to legal entities to put coercive mechanisms and regulations in place, that turns it on its head when the state is requiring the types of technological developments that perhaps not just democratic states, but even in some instances, probably some other types of authoritarian states would take issue with. And I say that, you know, some types of authoritarian regimes as well, because democracies are not going to be good all the time. And as I give this talk, I'm in the midst of waiting on presidential election results in the United States. And what we can see in this instance is that even within a democracy, there can be very strong leaning authoritarian personality and psychological traits among populace. And if that is true, then those individuals who are creating technologies can also engage in the development of technologies that could potentially violate the rights and privileges of large swath of at least this country, not to mention the proliferation of that technology across international borders and how that affects the world at large. And so authoritarian psychological traits are present everywhere. And so that's something also to consider, that we can't really govern an authoritarian personality trait. What we have to do is to put into place better education. We have to enculturate responsible and ethical design. We have to think about the kind of the Western liberal democratic values of individualism and freedom of thought and freedom of action and freedom of speech. And so those are the kinds of things that are the bulwark against the psychological authoritarianism. But those are not things that are easily governable. And when we're talking about the technology creation, by not just, we can say companies and industries and sectors and governments, but all of those entities are made up of the people. And so the people creating those systems need to be encultured into the way of responsible research and innovation. And that is not an easy lift, and it cannot be done by a top-down mandate or some sort of coercive legal norm or law or rule. That also said, thinking about whether or not certain types of sectors or should be prohibited from engaging in scientific development and technological development. So, for instance, there's a lot of focus on whether or not militaries and states' military should be allowed to pursue scientific development. And truth be told, so many of our scientific breakthroughs occur in basic research that it would be hard to stop basic research. And governments tend to fund basic research quite heavily. And so there would be some difficulties, I think, in parsing out what is and what is not allowed and when risk assessment frameworks have to come in and who should be deciding. In the United States instance, should Congress be deciding? Should the military be deciding? And the reality is that many of the people in these governance positions, particularly policy positions, do not have the scientific background in order to effectively and wisely make any sort of policy or legal recommendations. And so that in and of itself brings risk of over-regulating or under-regulating when you don't have a scientific educated populace in order to do that. And so ultimately, I think that there's not really one single shot approach or solution to technology governance. We have international fora, we have non-governmental organizations, we have states, we have industries, we have people, we have all sorts of different types of actors at work here. And I think there needs to be a carefully considered distributed system, right? This needs to be coordinated in some sense, but it needs to be distributed because much like as Madison has said in Federalist Paper number 10, you need factions. You need lots and lots of different factions to balance against one another's interests. And it is only with the countering of factions with more factions can you actually maintain kind of a steady state. And if that steady state looks like responsible research and innovation, then that push for the development of norms, that push for the development of a different way of thinking that designers and companies and everybody are all responsible at the same time, then that kind of that distributed faction, that distributed control, that distributed governance approach can start to take shape. But there is no one single shot. And there is no, even at the international stage and at the international forum, there's no global enforcement mechanism that could even begin to think of it that way. And nor should we want a single global enforcement mechanism because our entire international order is premised on the foundation of state sovereignty. And to give an international organization the ultimate sovereign power would be to create a world state. And I don't know if anybody, at least in my world, wants to see that happening because all of the states have their own incentive structures, their own foreign policies, and their own desires for power. And so much as we federated the international system, so too must we federate the ways in which we create governance mechanisms, soft or hard, distributed or centralized. And so at that, I will leave you to think about culture and how culture influences things, how regime types actually influence and drive innovation through funding mechanisms and through dictates of what should and should not be pursued. And then ultimately about this distributed way of thinking about the world, the Madisonian Federalist 10. And I hope that gives you something to chew on as we move forward. Thank you.